Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Um, Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Stuart Phillips on how to survive and thrive during this pandemic with some very practical activity and nutrition tips. Before we get into the presentation, I do want to thank our corporate platinum sponsor, PIA Law, for helping make all of this possible. With their support, BIST has been able to continue delivering our programs and creating webinars to provide our members with important information during this difficult period. We are so appreciative to have the capability to keep our community engaged despite these circumstances, and we simply could not have done it without their help. So thank you, PIA Law. Okay, now to tell you a bit more about our presenter, I'd like to welcome Lindsay Charles. Lindsay joined McLeish Orlando as a law student, and following her call to the bar, she was hired to the firm as an associate lawyer. Lindsay's practice is devoted exclusively to plaintiffs' personal injury and wrongful death cases, injury motor, vehicle collisions, occupiers liability, products liability, medical negligence, and disability benefits claims. Lindsay regularly appears on the Superior Court of Justice and License Appeal Tribunal. She has been co-counsel on a precedent-setting arbitration to restore denied benefits and on a precedent-setting motion to have a fraudulent conveyance action proceed concurrently with a personal injury action. Before pursuing her law degree, Lindsay was the captain of McMaster Varsity swim team and represented her school at a provincial and national championship. In her free time, Lindsay enjoys early morning F45 workouts, training for triathlons, skiing, golfing, and throwing a stick to her dog Molly. So please welcome Stacey Stevens, or Lindsay Charles, pardon me.
Okay.
My apologies.
Thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate the very kind introduction. So today I'm going to introduce to you a great speaker, Dr. Stuart Phillips, who's going to be presenting to us today. So Dr. Phillips obtained a PhD from the University of Waterloo in human physiology in 1995. He joined McMaster in 1999 and is currently a full-time professor in the Department of Kinesiology and School of Medicine at Mac. He is a Tier 1 Canada researcher in skeletal muscle health. He is also the director of the Masters in Nutrition, Exercise Science, Health Research, and Physical Activity Center of Excellence. Dr. Phillips was the inaugural recipient of the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology's Mentorship Award in 2017. And in 2018-2019, he was named as highly cited researchers list as being in the top 1% of all cited researchers in nutrition and exercise research. Dr. Phillips is also a fellow of the American College of School of Medicine and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. So over to you, Dr. Phillips, for a great presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Lindsay. Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to the folks at the BIST Network for allowing me to give you this presentation today. I think, first and foremost, during this period of time, it's obligatory for me to say that I hope everybody's well, staying that way, and just to wish everybody well during this unprecedented time. So the title of the talk, as Ryan said, is Surviving and Thriving in a Pandemic, Activity and Nutrition Tips. So what I'm not going to do during this presentation, just right off the bat, is to give you some sort of magic prescription that will either A, allow you to avoid getting COVID, because I don't think anybody's got that, but at least give you maybe some practical tips to take away that you can either share with your family or your friends, practice yourself, and that will allow you to maybe navigate this in a somewhat less stressful fashion than you're currently doing. What I want to do first is to talk a little bit about stress and to talk about so-called good or bad stress. First of all, stress is a good thing. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. The stress associated with getting to work is sometimes bad. Sometimes work stress or life stress is obviously a negative thing. But stress is a biological signal response system that allows us to cope with the demands of day-to-day life. People who do not mount adequate stress responses to stressful situations just don't cope particularly well. What we do know, however, is that too much stress, or what is usually referred to as chronic stress, is a bad thing. And I'm sure some of us have been in situations that are associated with an acute rise in stress, where we have physiological reactions like heart palpitations, shortness of breath, anxiety, and feelings that are simply not really beneficial. The point then is to balance this good stress and bad stress and to try and allow ourselves to recover. One of the stresses that I'll talk about in this presentation is actually physical activity or exercise. Your body reacts to that form of stress in a negative sense during the exercise, but in a positive sense because we allow ourselves to recover afterwards. So I think it's important to realize that all that your body understands is the physiological response to the stimulus of stress, whether it's external or internally created. But sometimes the recovery from that stress has associated with it very beneficial outcomes. Of course, the big stressor that all of us are operating with now is having COVID-19 in the background. So the new baseline stress has been to wake up every morning to receive a report on how many people are sick, how many people have died, and how many people worldwide are in the same situation. Add on top of that the uncertain economic times, the uncertain healthcare times, and the baseline stress that all of us are living under has been amplified. Now we can add on top of that all of our usual stressors that might otherwise not be as prevalent simply because we've got a baseline that's somewhat elevated. So this is the background against which we're working. So I'm trying to give you some information then on what you can really do to help with respect to COVID. A lot of the figures that you're going to see come from a free guide, the address for which I'm going to give you at the end of this presentation, but from a group of experts who have come together to provide a guide to staying fit, staying well, and staying sane during coronavirus. And you can see some of their web addresses below the figures that I'm going to use. I want to say right off the bat, and my rider statement is to say that physical distancing, washing your hands, not touching your face, avoiding sick people if that's possible, and wearing a mask are the foremost measures that anybody and everybody should be taking to try and prevent or lower their risk for infection. On top of that, then, we're going to talk about some things that I think are important on a personal level that include, first and foremost, building resilience. We'll talk about what that is, what it means, some tips for building it, or some tips for strengthening it if you're currently in good shape. We're going to talk about sleep, and I'll be the first to admit that I could probably use some of my own advice because I'm not a particularly good sleeper. We're going to talk about exercise and physical activity. We're going to talk a little bit about diets and fluids, and then we're going to talk about supplements. Resilience is defined by Merriam-Webster as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, the characteristic of having toughness, if you will. But resilience exists on many, many levels. Instead of me drowning you with a number of boring slides, what I'm going to do is to use infographics like the one you see on the left, courtesy of a good friend of mine named Jan Lemur, who's a professor at the University of Nice, to go over some of the concepts, and I'll just simply use the infographic, which I think is a condensed form of the information, and talk a little bit more about some of the points that he makes. So the expert behind this is a fellow named Mustafa Sakar. He's an expert in the development of both physical and mental resilience as it applies, for the most case, to athletes being able to withstand stress. However, the principles are exactly the same no matter whether you're an athlete or a mere mortal trying to survive coronavirus. So the first thing is to talk about processing negative emotions. during this time, it's normal for people to experience an increased sensation of anger, guilt, and anxiety. There's no question that these are negative emotions and can draw energy from our, if you like, fully charged self, where if we get a good night's sleep and wake up, we feel like we can take on everything. You have to recognize then the ability to deal with these through looking at what social support is available. So whether this is personal in nature, social in nature with respect to talking and maybe conversing with friends. Personally, I get a lot more out of a conversation where I can see somebody. So devices that have things like Zoom or WebEx, FaceTime, Skype, or various applications to actually look at somebody face to face during this time, and to be proactive in what's called personal development. So to set goals for yourself that might not seem like they're worthy goals outside of this situation, but within the current circumstances are definitely something to aspire to. That could be something as small as reading a book, for example. And definitely to be sensitive to the decisions that you make as active choices rather than sacrifices. That is, I'm not giving something up, but this is an active part of what I do and everybody is doing during this time to cope and deal with the anxiety and the pressure that I'm facing. To foster resilience in others, and that is to provide your own personal support and your own personal challenges and share those with other people. I'm often reminded that a question I might ask my students is, how's it going? When really the question is, what's the biggest challenge that you're facing? And trying to understand what it is that people are dealing with during this quite unprecedented time. The other part, and this is a tough one, is to take a quick gut check of what it is that you can control and what you can't control. As the phrase goes, there's very little to be gained by worrying or trying to do things about what it is you cannot control. We can't control other people's reactions. We can't control the path to finding a vaccine for this. And we can't control many, many things. But we can control our own personal actions during this time. So when you cannot control, try and take responsibility for your actions. And this is what Professor Sakar calls the ABCs, so adversity, beliefs, and consequences. In the face of adversity, we have a self-defined set of beliefs which have emotional consequences. But as individuals, we're responsible for our own emotional reaction to a given situation. So your beliefs or thoughts may exacerbate what he says are the consequences, your feelings or behaviors that you're experiencing because of the adversity. So it's a reverse situation where you simply have to try in the moment to let go of some of the feelings that are maybe overwhelming you in a particularly negative or adverse environment. And finally, and I think we can all sort of subscribe to something like this, is that the regulation of your thoughts is much easier for the vast majority of people when they tell someone about them. So there are various social support systems that are available, if not in person, clearly over certain devices, and offered by a number of societies that I hope people are aware of so that they can manage some of the situations. But if all of this sort of seems a little bit overwhelming and a lot of people respond with, well, this is the way I've always thought, here are a few things that you can do to gain back a little bit of control in your own life. Again, I'm going to use an infographic because frankly, people's artwork is a lot more interesting than me just talking about something like this. You can probably see in the 3x3 grid here, I think, and in the 9 squares, a number of topics which we're both going to cover and talk about, but a number of things that probably people might not even realize allow them to gain a sense of control. But I'm going to attempt in the list on the right-hand side of your screen here to put some order to these topics. The first thing is to make a routine. Interestingly enough, one of the first posts that I read after the restrictions have been put in place for COVID was from somebody who was a submariner. And so probably didn't have a lot of choice over some of the things that he was doing while he was submerged, in some cases 300 and 400 meters below the surface of the sea. He gave the advice that a routine was absolutely crucial. In other words, leaving things in a sort of laissez-faire way and rising when you wanted, although it wasn't a choice in the Navy, was really what got a lot of people off kilter. Routine is something to be embraced when factors that are out of your control need to be brought in line with what it is you can and cannot do. The second thing is clearly to stay connected. There's no substitute, obviously, for physical contact with people, but hopefully people are in a situation where at least they can talk, if not see some of the people that they are close to on a regular basis. And with the current technology that's available, I'm pleased to say that that's actually probably not as difficult as it once was. Read a book. And this can be done in the old-fashioned way with a paper book or an electronic book. It's something to occupy your mind and take you away from the ever-present now, not just 24/7, but 24/7, 365 news that you can expose yourself to in this crisis. Followed then, right on the heels of reading a book, is to limit your exposure to news. There's been a lot of work done on how people, deal with traumatic events. We know, for example, in the wake of something like 9/11, which was, I don't think anybody would argue, an extremely traumatic event to both witness and hear and see the news from, the people who consumed less news in that time actually were able to classify the event as being less traumatic. You may want to think that you're not up with the most current news, but you can get the most current news in a very short period of time without exposing yourself to constant news coverage, which is available not just on television and the internet, but on your phone, which has now become a ubiquitous device to transmit information. Take a class, learn something new, pick a new skill, pick something to try and develop yourself during this time, and use what is probably a crisis time for a lot of people as an opportunity for development. Clean your home. I have to admit that this is not my favorite, but I will admit that my wife derives a great sense of joy over obtaining a clean or cleaner home. And personally, there are times when I find that tidying my desk has an enormously personal satisfaction associated with it. Keep a journal. This is something that a lot of people do, and they find out actually is quite helpful in dealing with some of the negative emotions that are associated with traumatic events. Relax. You're not in this alone. Everybody is facing the same situation. It's how you deal with it and how you find balance in these situations that is particularly important. Exercise, I think, goes without saying. And probably the reason to bring me on here is the association between my research, which is almost entirely dedicated towards the interaction between exercise and diet and health, and the positive effects that it can have, not just on your physical and health well-being, but on your emotional state. So, given all of the things that we've talked about with respect to COVID, what I'm going to do is to talk about not the obvious things, but to talk a little bit then about some of the beyond resilience things that you can do to help yourself during this time. The first of which, and I'm definitely not an expert in this area, is sleep. So let's talk a little bit about sleep. I think the rider statement that I need to make first is that there's probably, people are looking for a lot of tricks during this time, a shortcut, something that would say, you know what, if you do this, it's definitely going to make a difference. But everything probably is incremental, but this pyramid shows you, I think, the degree of importance that not just myself, but a number of experts place in terms of a hierarchy of what it is you need to do to deal with something beyond just your the outside world and your own personal choices. And sleep, you can see, is the foundation. We've got diet in there, we've got training or exercise, and we've also got right at the top, although some people would like to put this the foundation, supplements, which might help. So here's our Jan Lemur created infographic to give us some of the tips on sleep. And this comes from Professor Shona Halson, who's down in Australia, and she's a sleep consultant. And I know that sounds like an odd term, but believe it or not, every single professional team in the NBA and the NHL employs a sleep consultant, because people are beginning to recognize now the role of sleep in performance, like in sports, for example, but not just that, in our daily health. So one of the things I think that Shona would emphasize as being absolutely critical, and it speaks a little bit to routine here, is to go to bed and wake up at consistent times. It's obviously, with some of the other daily life demands maybe removed for some people, tempting to stay up later, to get out of bed later, or to do sleep, or to engage in sleep practices which are not the norm. But again, it's really important that we try and maintain as much as possible the routines that we stuck to during our daily lives prior to COVID. One of the other things is to open your windows. There's nothing like fresh air, and it says here to get some sunlight, which is probably easy for a professor in Australia to say. Here in southwestern Ontario, it's been a little bit in a little bit of short supply, but I think nobody would disagree with the fact that when you get outside and you feel the sun on your face, it has a very mood lightening effect. Indeed, there are parts of our brain which are probably ancient in origin, which respond to sunlight by releasing certain neurotransmitters that convey a sense of wellness. Be physically active, and if you're physically active, stay physically active. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And if you really need to, take a short nap. And by short, I'm talking about 30 minutes. There's a lot of research done on people who take naps that are longer in duration, and anything longer than about probably between 30 or 60 minutes could affect your sleep quality later that night. So 30 minutes is sort of the maximum time that people suggest for a nap that will not interfere with your sleep later. And it can be almost as reinvigorating as a cup of coffee. Social connectivity is clearly needed, and that probably transcends not just this category, but a lot of things that we've been talking about. Stay in touch with your friends, with your family, because it provides a sense of well-being. Avoid alcohol and binge meals close to bed. I think that a lot of people are under the perception that alcohol is an aid to sleep, and it's actually the converse is true. And speaking of things that keep you awake, coffee and caffeine, although it's not just a cup of coffee anymore, caffeine is available in a number of things. Figure out what it is that you can tolerate. Try and avoid screens. This is a tough one. Screens emit something called blue light. Blue light is perceived by our brain, and it's actually quite stimulating to our brain, and it keeps us awake. So phones, computers, video games, which have now become the almost ubiquitous activity for a lot of people prior to sleep, are things to be avoided. Now, there are certain sort of what are called blue light filters available on computers. Some cell phones have them. There are even glasses that can filter out blue light, which experts have shown actually help people get to sleep if they're insistent on viewing the computer screen prior to going to bed. You should avoid lying in bed if you're awake. If you can't fall asleep, if this is something that persists, you should get up and read using regular light, not an incandescent bulb or something from a computer screen, for example. And the idea here is for your brain and you to associate the fact that your bed is a place for sleep. And then finally, to realize, and particularly during this time, that it's normal not to sleep perfectly every night. If this is a persistent pattern, then you should probably seek out some type of medical advice, but perfect sleep just is not attainable by everybody all the time. And particularly during this time, disturbed sleep is probably more the norm rather than the exception. The last part, and you can see it with the thermometer here over on the left, is to realize that sleep is actually best when your room temperature is between 17 to 20 degrees Celsius, or if you use Fahrenheit, 63 to 68. I talk to a lot of people who say that they would find that particularly cold, but most of us get under covers, have pajamas on, etc., and try and keep ourselves warm. The truth is, again, that in research that's being done, if the temperature is above that, people actually fall into what we call deep or theta wave sleep for a lot shorter periods of time than they do if the temperature remains in that range. My wife would find that absolutely frigid. Personally, I'm really good with that, no problem. But it probably is an individual preference. I'm just giving you what the science is saying on that one. The 5 main enemies then of sleep are clearly summarized in this infographic right here. The first is light. Obviously, ambient noise, if it's beyond what you're willing to tolerate. Some people living in the city, for example, find the noise of traffic or trains or car horns, for example, quite soothing, whereas other people would find that almost deafening and they'd be unable to sleep. High heat is clearly something, or low heat, excessively low heat, is clearly something that is going to disturb your sleep. Remember that temperature range that I gave you. Alcohol, despite the popular perception, is not something that helps you sleep. It actually results in less or lower, I would say, quality sleep. And caffeine is clearly something that we want to try and limit or avoid if possible. So then let's go down the list. What have we talked about here? We've talked about resilience. We've talked about sleep. Let's talk a little bit about exercise. And as an exercise physiologist, this is something that I care deeply about, but I don't also want to oversell the possibility that you could completely alleviate some of the risks by keeping physically active or exercising. First of all, we need to draw, I think, a distinction between physical activity versus exercise. Physical activity is the act of engaging in something, anything, that requires the expenditure of energy. This could be simply standing versus sitting. It could be something like going for a walk versus standing. Exercise is planned and purposeful engagement in acts of physical activity for the presence of improving your fitness, be that either cardiovascular fitness or muscular fitness. And I think we all have a fairly good definition of what exercise would be. It's purposeful engagement in an activity that we know or we think is trying to do something more than just keep us fit or healthy. So I'm going to use 4 situations, and sorry for the quality of the figure here, just to illustrate a point. So the 4 individuals you can see here are Joe, Kim, Mike, and Ann. And I've broken up their day into various types of activity. The green activities are moderate to vigorous activity, or what we would call exercise. They're planned activities that Joe and Kim and Mike engage in on a regular basis. They're in various forms at various times of the day, but the reason that Joe, for example, you can see goes for a bike ride is that Joe likes to race bikes. He wants to get better at racing bikes, and so he does it with purpose and with the purpose of becoming fitter and trying to race bikes with his friends and achieve some sort of increase in performance. Kim, on the other hand, likes to lift weights. Kim's like me, she gets up early in the morning, and the first thing she would probably do is go to the gym. Kim doesn't compete in weightlifting, but she likes to try and push herself to do something more today than she did yesterday. Mike is a soccer player. He does it at lunchtime. He does it on a regular basis, but he does it just for fun. It's not necessarily that Mike gets any better at playing soccer, but he enjoys the recreational activity, but it's purposeful engagement in something during his lunch break when everybody else is sitting down and eating their lunch. Anne, on the other hand, doesn't engage in any form of planned exercise. And the interesting point is, and probably this is new, I think, to a lot of people, is that Anne also doesn't engage in these yellow periods of breaking up her sedentary activity by engaging in something such as going for a coffee, going for a walk around the office, standing at her desk instead of sitting. What we've begun to realize over the last 5 to 10 years is that the failure to break up your sedentary periods of time is associated with a far greater risk than simply engaging in enough exercise, but then spending the rest of your day sedentary in terms of alleviation of risk. So if we were to grade everybody's risk in this situation from just about every known chronic disease, be it heart disease or cancer or lots of others, type 2 diabetes, for example, but also the risk for becoming infected because exercise affects immunity, then the person with the highest risk would clearly be Anne. Mike is obviously enjoying some benefit because of the exercise that he engages in. Kim's a little further up the ladder, but someone like Joe, because he's breaking up his sedentary time, is at a lower risk. The person who's not in here, who I'm going to sort of recreate for you to illustrate a point, is somebody that doesn't exercise, but yet breaks up their sedentary time with some sort of mildly active physical activity. So this is a person in this grid down the bottom. It's actually Joe's day, but we're going to imagine it's a different individual. And instead of engaging in a bike ride, this individual has to spend their time commuting from work. So they're going to be sedentary because they're sitting in a car. However, you can see that this person doesn't do any moderate to vigorous physical activity, but does break up their sitting time. Their pie doesn't look like the one at right. It actually has almost half of it in terms of sedentary time. But because of the yellow, in other words, breaking up those sedentary times, this person is actually at a lower risk for all kinds of things, including chronic diseases and infection, compared to Anne. So it's not this, but maybe it's not as good if you want to make a value judgment as Mike or Kim or Joe. The point I'm trying to make here is that the biggest reduction in risk comes when we take someone who does nothing to doing something. But that something doesn't have to be engaging in a bike ride or running a marathon or lifting weights every day. By all means, if you can do that and you enjoy doing that, then do it. But simply breaking up sedentary time is associated with a rather profound reduction in risk for a number of chronic diseases, but also for infection. So what can we do instead of sitting? Probably, I think 10 years ago, nobody would have cared about even doing some of these activities. But now you can see people with standing desks. You can see people with exercise balls, leaning stools, kneeling chairs, all of which have a slightly higher energy expenditure associated with them versus sitting. It's also true that if we broke up these periods of sitting and so went for a cup of coffee, went for a walk around the office, or even took a flight of stairs every 30, 45 minutes, we could substantially reduce people's risk for contracting all kinds of chronic diseases. So this little infographic, again from Jan Lemur, sort of emphasizes that point. So we're talking about physical activity. The first tip of which is to break up your sitting time. Avoid prolonged, uninterrupted bouts. And you can see 30 minutes sort of being where most people believe you need to get up out of the chair. Be active throughout the day. This can be, simply going for a short walk. It can be taking a flight of stairs up and down. I recommend getting outside if possible. Clearly, the Canadian winter doesn't always lend itself to that, but we're heading into spring now, and hopefully we'll be able to get outside a little bit more often. Try to get outside, I think, is really big. As I said, if the sun is shining, it makes an absolutely huge difference. Any active break matters, but intensity does too. So I think, sort of take home here is stand, don't sit, walk, don't stand, or run, don't walk. Clearly, intensity matters a little bit. But I have a colleague named Marty Gabala who is actually one of the leading researchers in using practical forms of high intensity exercise as a way of alleviating health risk. And interestingly enough, while his first research started by having people on a bike sprinting all out for 30 and 60 seconds at a time and recovering and doing it again, he's now gone to the point where he shows that people who engage in going up and down 2 or 3 flights of stairs experience far less excursions in things like their blood sugar, their blood lipids, and they begin to regain control of a lot of risk factors for chronic disease. So it might not take much, but the intensity does begin to matter. Try not to keep your phone nearby. I had to laugh when I read this one because everybody's phone is usually within arm's reach. But if you had to get up out of your chair, walk across the room, pick your phone up, and then walk back and sit down. The interesting part from a physiological standpoint is you've gotten out of your chair, you've broken up your sitting time, and you've achieved goal number 1, which is not to sit too long. A lot of people will kind of roll their eyes and say, well, that's not really very much physical activity. And they'd be right. But what we do know about sitting is that it's probably in the range of, I would say, eating a very poor diet on a regular basis in terms of the risk it places on your future health. It reminds me of an old Saturday Night Live skit where when television remotes first became available, people were dismayed by somebody not having to get up and go and change the channel. I can't remember the last time I did that personally, but what they proposed as an alternative was a box with a lock on it in which you locked your remote so that you did have to get up and change your channel. As laughable as that seems at the time, it could probably change the course of a lot of people's health if we had something similar for a cell phone. So break up your exercise into exercise snacks. We all probably are aware of the physical activity guidelines and the prescriptions that they call for, but one of the recognitions in the revision of the new physical activity guidelines is that people can do their physical activity in much smaller bouts throughout the day. Finally, active recovery. In other words, if you're tired, don't lie. If you can sit, and if you can avoid sitting, then try and stand. So try and do something in the recovery phase that simply isn't laying out and crashing after you've done something physically active. So if we're going to exercise, what exercise should we do? And here's where I think I get a little bit pragmatic. Although the research that I do is more related to resistance exercise or weightlifting to try and maintain your strength, the guidelines for the past 50 years have been squarely focused on aerobic activity. And for good reason. We know that engaging in regular aerobic activity reduces risk for a number of chronic diseases, and also, when engaged in to not a significant extent, improves your immune function. So if we're talking about aerobic activity, we can talk about all kinds of things: running, walking, biking, jogging, dance, Zumba, aerobics, skip, tennis, hockey, golf, you name it. It doesn't really matter. There are thousands of them. When we talk about resistance exercise, we could talk about going to the gym, doing body weight exercises. I have not gone to the gym now for 6 weeks, but I can still do a push-up, a sit-up. I can still do something physically active, a body weight squat, CrossFit, circuit training, calisthenics, yoga, and Pilates fall into resistive categories, if you ask me. The important point with all of this is to pick something that you enjoy and to do it repeatedly. If whatever it is that you're doing to be physically active or exercise is something that you don't like doing, research has shown that the chances of you adopting that as a behavior that you would repeatedly engage in and for a long period of time are extremely small. So try and find something you enjoy. Do it with a friend, do it at the same time of day. That generally works for most people. If you don't like to be inside when you're physically active, then definitely try and get outside. If you don't like to be outside, then stay inside. Try and do it any way you can. The prescription, of course, is the standard 150 minutes a week, 5 days a week, 30 minutes, resistance train twice weekly, engage in stretching, and for some people, balance exercises. Hopefully, however, what you've taken away from this is that you can get away with a lot less and still reduce your risk for a number of chronic diseases, and during this time, actually improve your resilience and your ability to be able to withstand infection. The last thing then I'm going to talk about, or one of the last things, excuse me, that I'm going to talk about is diet. I think this is where over the last probably 10 or 15 years, research has exploded. At the same time that research has exploded, the amount of disinformation or misinformation has exploded in parallel. I'm fond of telling undergraduate students that I teach that when it comes to diet, finding the signal, the truth, if you like, in the noise is much harder now than it has ever been. Mainly because people now begin to fall into dietary tribes, extremes of one or the other, ketogenic diets, all vegan, vegetarian diets are the norm. And people who find particularly weight loss as a solution to changing a diet makes them a true believer in that that is the only way to lose weight. Nothing, however, could be further from the truth. When we talk about ideal diets, I don't think that there is one. I'm going to unfortunately distill this down to some very generic information, and I think it goes something like this. When I tell athletes or when I tell people who are looking for the way that they should eat, I tell them to shop around the outside of a grocery store. Avoid the inner aisles because that's where the value-added products are contained. Produce, meat, dairy, eggs, and breads and cereals are on the outside of most grocery store shelves. I should probably actually say that cereals occupy an inner aisle for the main reason now that I think the latest statistic I heard was that we receive on our grocery store shelves something like 57 or 58 new cereals a year that probably dilute some of the beneficial whole grain cereals that are out there. So quite simply, it's despite the 1,000 or probably more diets or dietary approaches, we should try and eat real or whole foods as much as possible. These are the things that people had eaten for centuries. People obviously are living longer now, but the diet wars that are being fought are not fought at the extremes where I still think that whole food, real food diets actually make a lot of sense. It should be fought in the middle. In other words, if there are things that have been introduced into the human food supply which have had a negative or adverse consequence on our health, it's highly processed, highly manufactured foods that are providing energy dense but nutrient poor choices to people. So the best diet is always also the one you can stick to. Clearly, if there are particularly favorite foods that fall into the category that I was just mentioning, if you, for example, took ice cream away from my wife, there's no way that she would stick to any diet that I would recommend, then there's no chance that that's going to happen if this is the way that you try and plan your diet. So you should always engage in things that give you pleasure. But if there's something that you recognize as an energy dense and rather nutrient poor food, then it's probably not something that should be the staple of what you eat. So I think one of the things that a lot of people are experiencing during COVID is that people's mood is not particularly good. In a state where we're angry, in a state where we're anxious, we seek out what we call comfort foods. Comfort foods for a lot of people provide some sort of gratuitous release, but frequently are not probably the foods that we should choose on a habitual basis. Whether fat gain is the consequence or not, I don't think is particularly relevant. But one of the things that we should realize is that if we're in this mood and we have at hand foods which fall into the categories that I've mentioned, then we're probably going to consume more of them. Whereas what we should be doing is trying to plan as judiciously as possible to eat the whole foods that I'm talking about. It's disappointing probably for a lot of people when I flash up Canada's food guide. It's not sexy. It was never a bestseller. If you can see me on your screen, I'm not clad in a bikini. You don't want to see that for the record. But this is what science tells us is the way that we should be eating to promote the best and optimal health that we can. You can probably see that this is Canada's newest version of the food guide, and for a lot of people, it's undergone a substantial facelift. In other words, the milk the dairy and dairy alternatives category has been compressed into the meat and alternatives category to create the protein foods category. You can see the protein food occupying the top quadrant of your plate here. For those of you that know me will know that I'm actually a protein researcher, and it was disappointing for me to see that some of the foods that I think should form a bigger part of a lot of people's diets were now occupying a smaller part of the plate. But one of the things that I want to mention is that protein sources don't necessarily have to come from the traditional animal-based sources that a lot of people believe should be the core or foundation of a lot of planning or dietary principles. So legumes, peas, beans, for example, are good sources of protein and also good sources of things like dietary fiber. But that's not to say that meat or eggs or milk or yogurt, for example, couldn't also be part of this. When we talk about grains, you can probably see that it's a much smaller portion of the plate than it previously occupied. And the choice that's emphasized is whole grains or non-refined or highly processed grains. Fruits and vegetables take up the majority of the plate. And the idea here is to convey that this can be all kinds of fruits and vegetables. The idea with using the colors as well is to emphasize that deeply pigmented, differently colored vegetables like carrots, broccoli, blueberries, strawberries are really giving you benefits beyond just the usual what people associate with fruits and vegetables, which is things like vitamins, for example. But the deep pigments give you lots of benefits in anti-cancer, for example, fighting properties that probably we're beginning to realize are not available in the purified supplements that would be derived from, example, tomatoes or apples. So the purified compounds, which people have lent on for years as being the key and the reason why having a diet that is higher in fruits and vegetables was associated with a reduced risk of cancer, we're now beginning to see are actually only available when you eat the whole food itself. It's a lot to take in, but this change in Canada's food guide comes with some substantial shifts in health. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this is not a food guide that received any input from the food industry in terms of its creation. So I think it can be viewed probably more so than a lot of other Canada's food guide as being evidence-based. The last part then is to think all of these things, and probably the thing that a lot of people want to rely on probably more than anything else is supplements. However, to take you back to that pyramid and to recall that right at the top and having the smallest influence on your risk for infection, for example, or improving your health, were supplements. And I'm probably going to disappoint a lot of people when I can say that you can easily summarize the supplements that I'm going to talk about into these three here. They're vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc. Vitamin C is obviously an important vitamin that plays a heavy role in immunity, but I don't think beyond the recommended dietary allowance, or what's called the RDA of vitamin C, there's an awful lot of evidence to suggest that larger doses are associated with greater immune effects, and that's what you can see in the table at right. The next one is vitamin D. Again, it's the sunshine vitamin, but because Canadians live at the northern latitude that we do, we don't get an awful lot of useful sunshine, although that's still the best way to get your vitamin D if you can get outside. So taking it in a supplemental form is probably beneficial. Some of the values you can see here, and most people are familiar with vitamin D in terms of international units, are as low as 400 and as high as 800. I would probably say, however, that in the last decade or so, there's been more interest in increasing the upper end of these intakes for vitamin D, quite simply because it's associated with lots of health benefits, particularly from an immune standpoint. The last nutrient that I'll talk about is zinc. It obviously has a lot of roles in immune function, and the table here on the right gives you the ranges in which you should probably be aiming at. I think what I would probably take away from this then is that a lot of these can be obtained in a single multivitamin and not a high-end, expensive dissolve on your tongue or various other iterations, what we call mega vitamin. So in other words, there's no point in exceeding the upper ends of a lot of the doses for these nutrients that you'll see here. So the take-home points from our presentation, hopefully I've convinced you that the things that we need to practice during this time are all of the relevant COVID protection measures. We should physically distance, wash our hands, not touch our face, avoid sick people, and wear a mask. Particularly if we're in enclosed small spaces, I think probably wear a mask is one of the most confusing, but the evidence now will, I think, begin to show in the next probably month or so, and the guidelines will begin to emphasize this as an activity which is considered a normal thing to do. Resilience is something that we all have to foster. I hope I've given you some tips to try and build, and if you are a resilient person, to try and improve upon the resilience that you currently have. Everybody needs to try and sleep the adequate amount. A lot of people can get away with about 6 hours of sleep, but the average is 8 hours. I often joke that in our house, between my wife and I, the average is 8 hours and I sleep 6. So my wife, who is a sleeping champion, more than makes up for what I do and sleeps an average of 10 hours a night. Exercise is obviously critical. It doesn't necessarily have to be running a marathon, and physical activity and breaking up your sedentary time is a crucial thing to recognize. Diet is clearly important, but probably not something that is core and key beyond eating whole foods and choosing to shop on the outside of the grocery store and less so down the aisles. And the last point is that the supplements, I think, that are out there that could alleviate your risk are probably a much smaller list than a lot of people would like you to believe. We have evidence for vitamin D, we have evidence for vitamin C, and we have evidence for zinc. However, what we don't have evidence for is that these should be consumed in mega doses, much beyond what is touted as the recommended dietary allowance for all of these vitamins at any given time. I want to thank you all very much for your attention and your time. I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. That was incredible. What an amazing amount of information. Yeah. We do have some time for questions. Everyone, if you look toward the bottom of your screen, there's a couple buttons I'll draw your attention to. There's a Q&A button and a chat button. if you throw a question in either of those, I will make sure Dr. Phillips gets it. I think I stood up 2 or 3 times during your presentation just feeling antsy. So thank you for the reminder.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
here
can't
we
actually
go.
see the Q&A, so.
Oh, so we already have a thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was incredible information.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, I'm sorry, you know, a lot of people, I think when I talk about this, they're expecting some great shortcuts or something like that. And it's maybe a bit disappointing to hear is that it's all the sort of boring regular stuff that probably a lot of people know.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Sorry, we did just get, it's more of a comment, but one of our members said that tryptophan found in pumpkin seeds makes him tired.
Mm.
Not sure if you could speak to tryptophan. I know that's with turkey and other foods that's been associated with sleep throughout the years. If you could comment on that at all.
Yeah, so tryptophan is a precursor to 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin. And I think, you know, the research on that is probably, there's not a lot of it. The main barrier is, and not to, you know, pun on the word, but your blood-brain barrier is very good at selecting things that it lets through, but it does let through tryptophan. And then the thought is that that then converts to serotonin in your brain and gives you a sense of calm. And for a lot of people who take tryptophan, a lot of people who take 5-hydroxytryptophan, the other precursor, it does lead to calm, and a lot of people it helps them sleep. My latest understanding, and again, I don't do a lot of research in this area, is that for some individuals it works very well. For other people, it doesn't really work. The latest recommendation is try it. It's a low risk proposition for most things. Supplements are always a little bit grainy, and I always say make sure you're getting it from a trusted source. I like Jameson as a Canadian supplier. I try and avoid buying things now off the internet, mainly because they come from other sources that I'm never really sure where they come from. But try it. If it works, anything that would promote sleep in a very, I think, natural way would be a plus.
Awesome. Couple more thank yous. A thank you from Colombia, actually. So amazing that we've we've made it out there.
Cool.
Sorry, this one's sort of for me here, Stu. Helen, we will be posting the webinar on our YouTube channel, and of course, everyone, you can find the link to that on our website as well as on YouTube. One more question here. Is there a danger to me wearing a mask for prolonged spans of time, breathing in CO2, wearing masks continually?
Right. So I've seen this question on a lot of forums, and I do spend time on social media, and I've seen this as well. So there's a number of different types of masks available out there. So there's a lot of now coming out, or sort of say fashion masks, cloth masks, or the usual sort of disposable masks that you can just put on. There's no danger with those at all. As long as the cloth is breathable, no issues at all. There's the so-called surgical masks, which usually have a fitted nose and come around, and you know, they're sold in places like Home Depot to keep the vapors from, you know, doing you know, paint stripping or some sort of fine particulate. And those, from what I understand, also don't pose a risk. The N95 mask, the one with the filter on it, do require, or usually require, a fitting. And the thought is, after a while, is that the filter could become saturated. I don't think anybody is at risk. I mean, masks are not something most people are used to wearing on a regular basis. It's like a lot of things, is to say, wear it. A lot of people find they get a little bit claustrophobic, then they tend to hyperventilate, and then they you know, is it CO2 building up and I'm getting lightheaded? Anything like that is always, you know, sit down. If you can, you know, remove the mask and do so safely. I think for most people, it's going to take some time to get used to. I do think it is going to become something that you'll see people do on a regular basis. If anybody has ever spent any time in Asia, it's just a daily thing there. People wear them all the time. They did before COVID for lots of reasons. And we're going to have to make some of that adjustment as well. Like anything, though, if it's not comfortable for you, there are always solutions. But that's something I think you're going to see change. I'll be honest with you.
Great. Yeah, and good reference points. Yeah, entire countries use these regularly.
Yeah.
So a couple more questions. This one, I'm going to add to it a little bit.
Okay.
So the first part is a smoothie beneficial? And I might ask you, a smoothie as a meal replacement, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm a smoothie lover. My usual routine. I've always been a morning person. I don't need to set an alarm. I know I'm one of these freaks. I wake up at around 5 just about every day. Um, I cup of coffee, and I'm either going for a walk. I'm on the bike. I'm in the gym. Well, I can't get in the gym now, but I have my basement where I go and do a body weight workout. I try and do something physically active, and then for me, a smoothie is a regular thing. No issues with smoothies. Is a convenient way to get a lot of things in. I love frozen fruit, all kinds. I love berries. If we've got bananas that are the kids haven't eaten, I'm chucking them in my smoothie. I throw in all kinds of things. It's usually my go-to sort of base for a smoothie is always, well, not always, but has more regularly been Greek style yogurt. I like the taste. Yogurt's like basically a superfood, I think. The Greek part of it is a little bit more protein, that's my research. And then pick your favorite. I put peanut butter in there. Sometimes I put a shot of coffee, like espresso or something. That's what I think I need. So, yeah, I'm a fan. There is one point to make though with smoothies is that liquids are not as satiating. They don't make you feel as full for as long as solid food. So if you're looking at it as a shortcut I know a lot of people use smoothies in weight loss plans, is that there's something to be said for eating solid food as opposed to drinking some of those things. But I like, it's convenient for me. It's just sort of part of the routine I do, but go for it.
Right on. Sounds good. The other piece of this was that they're asking, well, one of our members is asking about is walking beneficial. And I might ask you to speak to this with respect to exercise versus physical activity again, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I think I'll start off by saying this, is that I work in a world where, and probably Ryan, you can understand some of this. For the early part of my career, I worked with people who were younger, very physically active. And then I had the privilege of sort of, working with some very talented athletes, and even, consulting with some professional sports teams who are, I mean, clearly these guys are the cream of the cream, and these women are like, they're just phenomenal, right? And it's fantastic. I still do a little bit of that, not a lot, but it's fun. But they're not like you and me, or mere mortals. I mean, they spend their day is physical activity, and they're constantly looking to get better. I have friends who work out in the gym, and they tell me that they're constantly looking to get better, and I understand that too. But if we're just looking, and people say, what are you training for now? I say, well, I'm training to stay ahead of my three sons. But I'm training to stay fit and to try and age well, so to speak. So walking, to the people who are down the other end of the spectrum is like, why bother? But it's a fantastic form of exercise, not just from a health benefit standpoint, but some of the things that we're beginning now to uncover. And when I say we, it's not me, but lots of friends and colleagues, from the mental health standpoint, will show that walking as little as something like 15 minutes a day reduces symptoms in people with Parkinson's. it improves a lot of outcomes in Alzheimer's patients. It relieves depression, anxiety. The walking outside part is believed to be a big part of it because of people's connections with nature, and so outside walking is believed to be a much more beneficial activity than walking on a treadmill. Personally, like I like to do a lot of things in gym, but running or walking on a treadmill is just like that's not my thing at all. But I get it. But walking outside, particularly these days, I find, and nobody's saying with the social or physical distancing, don't go for a walk. I mean, you can still do that and still be physically distanced. But I find if I don't spend some time outside, I feel I don't feel as good. And so I don't know what it is, but I like fresh air. I even like when it's raining, but you can't beat the sunshine. It does a lot for your mood. But
Yes, yes.
huge benefits.
Yeah, thank you for commenting on going outside. I know there is a little bit of fear out there about, will I come into contact with people? But
yeah, and that's, I think, the balance is sort of, I see a lot more people purposefully engaging and walking, but it's odd, but I guess this is I hate to say new normal because the phrase is probably overused, but people come and they just part around each other, and they avoid each other. It's a little bit sad, but these are the times that we have to do, and it comes back we're not giving something up. This is just what we have to do. And there will be a day. I constantly remind my students, I'm like, get ready, keep yourself in good shape, keep yourself mentally sharp, do all the things, because when this is over, we're gonna have a big party.
yes, yes. A couple more questions. Many thank yous for such an awesome presentation. I don't want to discount anyone mentioning that. Maybe if you could provide a couple of examples of some sort of fatty foods, perhaps like in the protein section of that food guide, that are healthy, maybe some healthy fats. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think probably something that not enough people do, part of the food guide, I mean, there's always devils in the details in the food guide, for example. When people are choosing the types of fats that they would consume, like, I mean, it used to be, 20, 30 years ago, was carbs were good, fat was bad, and there were no nuances in the type of fat at all. But now we're beginning to realize that, within fats, there's a range of fats. Clearly, the saturated fats are the ones that people worried about, but the monounsaturated, so the olive oil, the canola oil, very heart healthy. The polyunsaturated fats, and so, sources of fat from fish, very heart healthy. The recommendation is to get 2 serves of fish per week, but most Canadians don't do that. A lot of people take polyunsaturated omega-3 fish oil supplements. Very dependent on the quality of the supplement. I'll be honest, that's probably one where you want to, if you're going to take it, spend more rather than less. But clearly within that, plant source fats, and so like a fatty plant source is like an avocado. 10 years ago, nobody would go near an avocado. Now, they're everywhere. But very heart healthy sources of plant-derived fats, and actually a very good source of protein as well, in a vegetable, which is not something I think a lot of people would probably realize. So we're beginning to understand a lot more about fats. The more unsaturated, be it mono or polyunsaturated, the better. Flaxseed is another one that people are just now beginning to realize the rich source of polyunsaturated fats. Canadians are actually, I think, for the most part, particularly if they cook and use canola, they're in good shape. It's not a highly processed fat. It contains a lot of mono and polyunsaturated fats, and is a good source of oil to cook in.
Awesome. So there's been a few more questions about masks. I might just see if I can pull all of these together a little bit. So part of it was that someone would like you to sort of like repeat what you had said, but some confusion about what mask is best. So, is a full face mask better? How long, if you had to put a maximum or limit on this, how long should I be wearing a mask?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to be a bit pragmatic about this. Again, I'm learning along with everybody else, probably in this time. My knowledge about, coronavirus is, it changes every day. So it almost seems like it's a moving target. But I think that there's a clear relationship between countries where masks were a regular part of daily life and the type of not only control of the outbreak that they've had, but then some of the reoccurrences and sort of surges, because a lot of the places in Asia, remember, that's where the virus first emerged. And so they were shut down, suppressed it, and now they're seeing there's a little sort of bump, but they're sort of being able to keep it under control. So they're probably about 3 or 4 months ahead of where we are. So just to be clear, cloth masks provide protection. Is it great protection? If you were in a hospital around patients, a cloth mask next to useless. Okay, an N95 mask fitted with the respirator on it and everything. So basically the filter, awesome. But for people out and about, probably overkill. If you're out not in an enclosed space, your risks of infection are remarkably low. There's no, particularly outside, there's no indication that there's sort of viral particles floating around. If you're in an enclosed space, if you're in the smaller the room, with people who could be sick, if you're in a grocery store or something like that, then a mask is a good idea. There's cloth masks, there's like a surgical style mask, and then there's the N95 mask. Probably very few people walking around with N95s unless you're somebody who happens to have gotten their hands on some of them before this crisis happened, or you're in healthcare. And you needed it when you're in healthcare because patients are coughing, sneezing, and the droplets then are the big thing. That's the advice, to cough or sneeze into your elbow. But my understanding is that for the most people out there, masks afford some protection, but there's still no guarantee. You could be close to somebody and still get infected, and these are unfortunately the hardest part of this is the unknown. There's so much we don't know, and that's why we have to try and make ourselves as resilient as possible in this time, to just sort of deal with new things as they happen.
Awesome. Yes. Questions about if the presentation can be sent directly to you. I did put my email in the chat, so do take a look there and email me. I'd be happy to send the presentation to you directly.
Yeah, and I'm happy to provide my slides and send you that. And if people want to look at them later, by all means. I'm also on social media. I'm on Twitter, MacKinProf, MacKinProf. That's on the slides as well. So look me up on social media. I try and limit my social media time.
No, it's a wonderful handle. I've been following you very closely, and yeah, it's a lot of good information coming from this social media, guys. It does look like that's it, and thank you again, Stu. This was a wonderful presentation, so much good information, and we really do appreciate your time today, your expertise. So thank you.
You're very welcome. The last part on the slides, and I don't know if the web address came up, the guys at examine.com, great group of people, friends of mine, but experts that I trust. They have a free guide that does a way better job than I could in this presentation of answering a lot of these questions, masks and all kinds of things included, absolutely free. Now, you might have to provide your email address, but they don't bug you. And if you say, I want to opt out, they'll leave you right out of it. But it's a fantastic resource and free.
Okay. Thank you again, Stu, and goodbye, everybody.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy.
Have a good one.
You too.